As a member of a board or committee of a club or a not-for-profit club here in Queensland, one of the most important parts of your role will be to ensure that your club is pursuing its objects. Those objects will specifically direct the club to focus on community activities. Sometimes those objects are very specific and sometimes they're relatively broad. And those objects and community contributions can be measured by way of cash and non-cash contributions. My comments today will be especially directed towards clubs that generate surpluses from machine gaming, but the general nature of my comments, however, will apply to clubs no matter how large and how small here in Queensland. The most important feature of a club in Queensland that distinguishes itself from a corporate for-profit entity is, in fact, what it does with its operating surplus. That surplus must be applied in accordance with the objects of the club and may be considered as your community dividend. Not a dividend in the traditional sense, but a not-for-profit dividend, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Because clubs provide community benefits and are not-for-profit entities, they receive special treatment. Sporting clubs, for example, pay no income tax, while all clubs pay reduced income tax only on the income they receive from non-member activities. We all know that clubs also gain access to a greater number of poker machines than their hotel counterparts, the maximum number being 280. We know that clubs pay less poker machine tax than their hotel counterparts, recognising the community contribution that is made by clubs. So what might be considered a community benefit? Well, let's run through some of the obvious examples. The provision of bowling and substantial golf facilities is one of the major community benefits that are provided here in Queensland by certain clubs. Provision and maintenance of football grounds and sporting grounds. The provision of club facilities itself might be considered a community benefit, community dividend. Of course, direct cash donations, grants and sponsorship grants are community benefits provided by clubs. We're all aware of the great work that surf lifesaving clubs do. How do we measure the community benefit of putting thousands of volunteer lifeguards on the beach every weekend in, weekend out during the summer, and some all year round? We know that the RSL network provides enormous advocacy services for returned and current and ex-servicemen and women and their families. We're aware that some clubs provide cheap and in some cases free accommodation in the regional areas for those people visiting a major centre to visit their doctor or to go, for example, to the hospital. And we can think of one in particular in Stanthorpe and one in Townsville. We know that the RSL is very active in representing itself and helping coordinate funerals for its members and ex-members. And of course, school education benefits from the club sector. We know that the RSL and the Surf Lifesaving are very active in terms of educating our school children in many areas. So how much community contribution, direct contribution, are clubs making? Well, the analysis that Clubs Queensland has provided suggests that for every dollar that enters a club, 4 cents is directly provided in terms of cash or close to cash contributions. Now you might say 4 cents in a dollar doesn't sound like a lot. But bear in mind, 85 cents out of every dollar that is received by a club is expended in operating costs, which only leaves 15 cents for community benefit. We know that some clubs have to replace their capital and have borrowings. And in most cases, or in the average case, that represents about 10 or 11 cents in terms of borrowing repayments or capital payments. So the surplus that clubs provide, just about every cent of the surplus that clubs provide, goes into community contribution. That's what clubs voluntarily provide. we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the state government also collects an enormous amount of tax from clubs. Clubs pay GST on their gaming machine operations at a rate of 9.1% or 1/11th, and of course are taxed directly on gaming revenue somewhere between 0% for smaller clubs that achieve less than $9,500 in gaming revenue a month, to as high as 35 or close to 36% on gaming revenue. We know that that doesn't go into consolidated revenue. In fact, 8.5% of that money goes into the Gambling Investment Fund, directly generated by clubs here in Queensland. But let's turn our focus now on the discretionary amount of community benefits that clubs provide. And what is and what isn't a community benefit? Well, first of all, we'll say that the government hasn't provided, and we think reasonably so, any guidelines as to what is a community benefit. It's really up to the industry, and we like it that way. But we would suggest 4 tests to be applied if ever you're wondering whether a benefit you're providing is a true community benefit. The first test we'd ask is, if you were a private entity, if your club was a private, for-profit entity, would you engage in the activity as a normal part of your business? And if the answer is no, well, it's probably a community benefit. If you were a corporate entity, a for-profit corporate entity, would you be putting lifesavers on the beach every weekend? Would you be investing enormous amounts of capital in rescue craft? Would you be lining football fields and soccer fields and cricket ovals? So we think that's a good starting point. The second question you might ask is, who benefits from the activity? Do the members benefit, or does the entity benefit, the club itself? And the best example I can think of is a courtesy bus. A courtesy bus used to ferry your customers to and from the facility so that they use your facility, I don't think is a community benefit. Not directly anyway. If that courtesy bus, however, is used to take a junior football team or senior citizens away for a trip, that certainly is a community benefit. There is a marginal part of that argument as well. Let's think of the person who is homebound due to some illness or disability, who can't get to the club other than through the courtesy bus. We believe that's probably a community benefit. The third question we would suggest you ask is, what is the real reason for the activity, the main purpose test? And that probably encapsulates the first 2 that we talked about as well. Finally, ask the question, if the club did not deliver that benefit, how would it be otherwise delivered, and who would deliver it? And if you find that the club would be the only entity in the community that would deliver that benefit, then you know full well that that is a community benefit. So the 4 tests, we believe, to extract and define as to whether an activity that you're participating in is a community benefit. The Queensland Office of Gaming Regulation has asked every club with 51 gaming machines and more to complete a community benefit statement each year. And the cumulative benefits contained in those statements have been issued by the Queensland Office of Gaming Regulation. And it might surprise you to know that clubs with 51 gaming machines and more alone contributed $37 million in benefits in 2006, comprised of close to $30 million in cash benefits and close to $8 million in non-cash or in-kind benefits. And that's increased progressively every year since 2001. And that takes no account of the smaller clubs with less than 51 machines. If we were simply to benchmark that against on a per machine basis for those clubs that do operate gaming machines, it results in around about $2,400 per machine per annum in community benefits, made up of $1,900 in cash and $500 in in-kind benefits. And if we apply this across the varying sizes of clubs that operate gaming machines, you will see that for a club of roughly 20 machines, there's an expectation of around about $48,000 in community contributions, according to benchmarks. The maximum size club here in Queensland might be expected to make around about $600,000 to $700,000 in captured community benefits. Now that will vary from year to year, and the Commission and the QOGR are well aware of the fact that some clubs go through lean trading periods. They're also well aware of the fact that some clubs renovate, borrow large amounts of money, and a fair amount of their cash is committed in servicing debt. So these are only benchmarks. They're only suggestions, and they may or may not be achieved from one year to the next, but it's a guideline. Of course, for those clubs that do complete a community benefit statement, we're all aware of what that statement looks like. It's a one-page document. It distinguishes between cash and in-kind. It distinguishes between affiliated and non-affiliated organisations. And it asks you to distinguish or identify where you spend your money in terms of charity and welfare, sporting organisations, community and other. There's not a lot of space for working on that document. There are so many stories that can be told behind that document. The bare minimum is their calculation sheet, which can be appended. And I'll talk later about the way we think community benefits should be measured and how they should be communicated. We think there are 6 elements to best practice in terms of delivering community benefit for clubs. And I'll run through each one of those elements. First of all, we think that clubs should identify the needs and where the needs of their community and where the benefits are most needed. In many cases, existing organisations in a community may well be filling that void. Lifeline, for example, may well be helping out families that have found themselves without a roof over their heads. But we can't think of one area in Queensland where there's at least some need that hasn't been fulfilled by an existing organisation. And so we think the first step for any club seeking to expand and diversify its community benefits is to actually go and do the research and find out where the benefit is most needed. We strongly encourage clubs to put some structure around their benefit program. Form a subcommittee. It should be part of every board meeting that a club has. There should be some sort of community benefit plan, even if it's a 1-page or 2-page document. It should be intertwined into the budget for the club. If you are giving away cash contributions, we believe there should be a formalised application process and guidelines in place. The application process would need to be very transparent and possibly even audited every year by your auditors. We believe that there is a duty on clubs that hand over members' cash and even in-kind benefits to the local community. There is a duty on the board and committee members to make sure that those funds have been acquitted properly and in accordance with their intended acquittal. So in other words, if we hand cash out for a specific purpose, we need to find out whether those funds have been expended for that purpose. It would help to see things like receipts. We believe that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of measuring and recording the benefits. In most cases, we believe that clubs under-measure the benefits that they provide to the community. And in most cases, in particular bowls clubs, we believe that the loss that would otherwise be made on bowls is a community benefit. Golf clubs the same. Then we believe the benefits should be reported, not only to the QOGR, not only to your members, but the wider community. Communicated, in other words, to the wider community. We can think of some best practice examples of community benefit structures. The Club of the Year East's Leagues has formalised a very detailed and structured community benefit program that benefits the community outside its strict objects of rugby league. Its objects do provide for the ability for that club to actually expand its community contributions beyond the game of rugby league. they've established a fund. The target for that fund is to have a number of millions of dollars in it by 5 years, and the income generated from that fund will fund a whole range of community projects outside rugby league. City Golf Club has just established a grant scheme where local organisations can apply for grants of up to $5,000, and has only recently allocated that first round of funds with members of the local stakeholders and members of council on the judging panel. We know that Hervey Bay RSL, as reported in one of the club insights, provides counselling services to its members, not only and specifically on responsible gambling or gambling harm, but on a whole range of issues. So anyone who's having difficulties can see the counsellor on site at Hervey Bay RSL, fully funded by the club and fully resourced. Beenleigh Bowls is a typical bowls club, 50 or so poker machines that provides a range of free entertainment evenings for its members, both elderly and young. Keppel Bay Sailing Club is another example of tremendous community benefit. That club trains something in the order of 200 school children every year or more in how to handle small sailing craft and also safety associated with the sailing activity. So there's a whole range of community benefits delivered by clubs here in Queensland. They're diverse, but they're very significant.
Jeff, I'd just like to ask, with that, do sporting bodies have to be affiliated with a club, and what's the difference between the non-profit part of it? You know, do the clubs have to be affiliated with a club to be non-profit, or?
Yes, well, that is the case. In some cases we've got a structure whereby, let's take a leagues club for example, is a separate entity to the football club. Two distinct entities, one in some cases might be a company limited by guarantee, in the other case the other entity might be an incorporated association. In that case, and let's use an actual case, Redcliffe Leagues Club Limited, they are not tax exempt under the Act, but of course the football club is tax exempt. But those two entities operate together. What is quite legal is to transfer any surpluses from the leagues club into the football club, which is tax exempt, and thereby the two entities operating together effectively pay no or very little income tax. And I think a lot of work is being done by John McCallum on making sure that our sporting entities remain tax exempt through the recent interpretation of the word case.
Just to clarify that, are you saying that the transfer from the leagues club to the football club is a tax deduction in effect for the leagues club and therefore not taxable?
Penny, yes, I think it is the case. It could be transferred by way of a donation. It could be transferred by way of a rent, and often is, as you know, as a legitimate and commercial rent. But simply can be transferred across by way of a donation, so it is a deduction.
So does that mean that sponsorships are classed that way too?
Yes, they are, Terry, sponsorships, but typically it's by way of donation, grant or rent.
Okay. So what's the best way to go to reduce the tax?
Anyway, the only reason we've had it taken out of a grant or a donation is when a bank becomes involved and they like to see a formal agreement between the two entities to lock in place money coming from the leagues club to the football club in that instance. Either that or the board of the football club says we want to formalise our arrangements long term to receive the income from the leagues club to the football club, so therefore we'd like to do it via a lease in that case. It guarantees the income to the football club then.
Why is operating the club itself not regarded as a community contribution?
Well, you're quite right. Operating the club or trading commercially, if we can use those terms, and we're very guarded about using the word commercially, but let's face it, the club does trade commercially and produce surpluses. And the word case told us that we're quite entitled to trade commercially and compete in the open market and make surpluses to allocate towards some sort of not-for-profit activity. Why isn't actually the trading expenses of the club considered to be a community benefit? Well, look, we'd love that to be the case. If that were the case, our community contributions would probably escalate by about 20 times. I think the government's leading the agenda on that one, and they would simply say that the operating expenses, the cost of buying alcohol, the cost of wages, the cost of replacing the repairing the chairs, the cost of paying for your electricity to chill down the venue, it's a bit of a long bow to draw there in terms of whether they're community contributions. We do know that in the Victorian market, our counterparts in Victoria are arguing very strongly that components of wages should be included as community contributions and other components of their operating expenses. And if pushed, we will argue that as well. But right now, where we sit, we tend to just look at the pure community contributions that clubs make. And I might say that doesn't include any of the volunteer labour, any of the other less measurable contributions that clubs make, just in terms of actually providing well-being to members, providing a great place for them to visit. That's not included in our community contributions measure of 30-odd millions of dollars, $38 million. So I think there's a long way to go to actually fully evaluate what clubs do for the community, but right now we've got a measure of around about $37, $38 million in cash and close to cash contributions.
Jeff, how does a club capture its cash and in-kind community benefits on its general ledger?
Well, that's a good question, Hayden, because the cash component, or what I would call the close to cash, cash is very simple. If you're making a donation, it's simply the value of the cash that you've donated. There's a whole range of close to cash contributions that clubs make as well, and that's where it starts to get very problematic. Take, for example, a $20 meal voucher that you give the local the fireys to raffle off, or probably it's higher than that, $100 meal voucher. Now, they take that meal voucher and they raffle it, and they make $300 on their raffle. My argument is that that should be captured as a $300 close to cash contribution. Now, your auditor might have troubles with that, and I think we've still got a little way to go in terms of the accounting standards catching up with or applying to clubs in terms of those sorts of transactions. At the very least, a $100 meal voucher should be valued at its retail value. I have seen some clubs, however, value it simply as the cost of goods, a much lesser value of providing that $100 meal voucher. So my argument is that why don't we capture it as what the fire brigade have made out of it? Now that's quite difficult. Your auditors, as I say, will have difficulty with that. In terms of providing, a good example of in-kind contribution is the provision of function rooms for meetings for Probus and Rotary and those sorts of organisations. And in most cases they're provided free of charge. We think that should be recorded as room hire fees in and donations out exactly the same as the room hire fees in. There is a problem with that though. This thing called GST, the room hire fees in, attracts a GST, and of course the donations out doesn't, but the room hire fees in does attract a GST. And someone's got to pay that GST in physical cash, which is a problem. I think wherever possible, clubs should endeavour to get and value their in-kind donations on their general ledger within the general accounting standards. And possibly there's a little bit of discussion they need to have with their auditors about that. Thanks for the question. So in summary, community contributions is at the core of what most clubs do here in Queensland. It's a major part of your business and a huge dollar value of your business. We believe community benefit programs should be planned, structured, measured, and most importantly, communicated to all your stakeholders in the community. Thank you.
Jeff, thank you very much. I couldn't agree more, folks. This is an area where we have underdone it in Clubs Queensland and all clubs throughout Queensland. We've under-recorded and under-reported this community benefit area. And Jeff, you've really hit the nail on the head, and we appreciate that today, because it is something we're going to need to get right to sell our communities and in turn governments in the future to the worth of clubs within Queensland and Australia. Crucial area, and Jeff, we really appreciate the time you put into this, and would you please thank Jeff Walson.